This is a lecture on general equilibrium and order. General equilibrium is a very important concept in mainstream macroeconomic theory. It imposes structure on economic processes and allows us to describe and analyze them. Many other concepts in economics are based on it. For example, the concept of the output gap, natural rates, potential growth, etc. The most elaborate definition of general equilibrium or intertemporal equilibrium has been described by Arrow and de Broglie in the so-called Arrow-de Broglie model, which was published in 1954. That model has formally proved the existence of such a general equilibrium in a market economy under very strict conditions. What is general equilibrium? General equilibrium is a situation where the plans and expectations with respect to the future of all economic agents are consistent. That means that all plans can be executed as they are and all expectations will be fulfilled. As long as there's no disturbance to the so-called data, so changed preferences, innovations, new knowledge about the likelihood of external events. General equilibrium is a logical concept. It is not empirical. There's nothing in the concept that says if and how equilibrium will be established. But even if one doesn't assume general equilibrium, thinking is along the lines of consistency or inconsistency of plans and expectations. So in economics, even if you do not accept equilibrium and think in terms of disequilibrium, still the equilibrium concept is there. There's another concept, and that's the concept of temporary equilibrium as introduced by Higgs. In that concept, in the concept of temporary equilibrium, we only assume short-term consistency of plans and expectations. Longer-term expectations are assumed exogenous or part of the data. But this concept undermines many of the concepts and methods used in mainstream macroeconomics. Rational expectations and the uses of natural values in particular. In mainstream macroeconomic analysis, general equilibrium is the explicit and sometimes implicit underlying concept. See, for example, the so-called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, the so-called DSGE models. They are based on and use the concept of general equilibrium. But this concept of general equilibrium is inappropriate to describe and analyze the real-world economic process. Economic agents have to plan or make decisions in the face of uncertainty. And in this context, the distinction between risk and uncertainty is crucial. What is a situation of risk? In a situation of risk, all possible outcomes and their relative frequencies of a decision or an act are known ex ante before you take the decision. Well-known example there, if you throw a dice, you know that there are 6 possible outcomes, but you do not know in advance which one will occur. But you are certain that it will be one of these 6. That's a situation of risk. Under uncertainty, this is not the case. You do not know all the possible outcomes of a certain decision or act. Now the crucial thing is that in the Arrow-de Broglie model, in the so-called ADM model, all possible outcomes are known. There is a complete market system. There is a market for any contingency, for any situation in the future. But here's the crucial thing. People, economic agents, cannot and do not know all possible future events. Economic agents cannot know now what they will discover in the future. And the impact of today's current acts and decisions may be affected by future discoveries, by future novelties. So that means that markets cannot be assumed to be complete. New markets may arise in the future. The market for iPhones wasn't there in the 1950s, for instance. And this is especially relevant to longer-term decisions, wealth and investment decisions in particular. As a consequence of the existence of uncertainty, the inevitable existence of uncertainty, the general equilibrium concept underlying mainstream macroeconomics is inappropriate. But the same is true for thinking in terms of disequilibrium, because it's derived from and related to the concept of equilibrium itself. So what's the alternative? The alternative is not to think in terms of equilibrium or disequilibrium, but to think in terms of order. What is order? How do we define the concept of order? Let me list what we mean by order. First of all, it is the set of possible patterns in an economy. And a pattern is a general outcome. These patterns, these general outcomes, emerge from the interaction between economic agents, acting purposefully. And they act on the basis of rules, algorithms, in a broad sense. And with a broad sense, I mean that they include moral rules, conventions, institutions, etc. Order is not static, it evolves. The rules and algorithms for changing the rules are there, and time is essential in evolving order, because acting takes time. And these general outcomes, these patterns that emerge, are often the unintended outcome of purposeful interaction. So that's the general idea of what an order is. And it's important also to mention that orders are not always designed. They are not constructed. They emerge spontaneously from the interaction of individual economic agents. Let me give an example to make a little bit more concrete what we mean by an order. And let's describe what I would call the market order. What are the rules and the algorithms that describe a market order? Well, the most important ones are things like property law, bankruptcy law, competition law, etc. So what are the typal general patterns that emerge in a market order described by the rules just mentioned? There are at least three that I could mention. The first one is that in a market order, in a market economy, described by the rules that I just mentioned, there is a tendency to cost minimization. Secondly, there is a tendency to growth and innovation. A market economy tends to grow. In a market economy, you tend to see innovation. And thirdly, a pattern in such an economy, in such an order, is that the so-called law of one price holds. The law of one price means that for the same product at the same place, you will pay the same price. Note that consistency of plans and expectations is not a requirement for order. There's no reference at all in this concept to plans and expectations, let alone to the consistency of those plans and expectations. Now, order assumes a theory, a mechanism for deriving the patterns from the rules of interaction. Why is it that in the market order that I just described, these patterns arise? Why is it that you have this tendency to cost minimization, for instance? Well, in this context, in this example, it's relatively simple. Because a market order is a competitive order. And how can you win the competitive game, as it were? That is by either being cheaper than your competitors or having better products. And trying to get cheaper than your competitors drives the cost in a market economy lower and lower to the lowest level. And the other way in which you can win from the competition is to come up with better products, new products, and that's the tendency to innovation. Basically, it's as simple as that. So it is important that we have a theory for deriving patterns from the rules of interaction between the economic agents. And I think there's a lot of fruitful work to do to derive such theories and to develop the theories. But we don't have to start from scratch there. There is important work in this context that's very relevant for further developing the concept of order has been done in the past. Work of Friedrich von Hayek, the famous Austrian economist, and von Mises come to mind. Von Mises introduced the so-called concept of praxeology, which is a rather complicated term for a theory of how people act in a situation that is complex and uncertain at the same time. Also, the work of Keynes contains useful elements. In explaining patterns, what probably is required is a kind of a generalized game theory. We may also call it a logic of human action or interaction. So that's related to what I mentioned just before, to the concept of praxeology from Mises. It may be useful to use the method of so-called cellular automata, a logic of interacting individual elements. If you look at economics through the lens of order providing structure, then it has important methodological consequences. It has important consequences for what economics is about and for what economics can provide you in terms of knowledge and what it cannot provide in terms of knowledge. For instance, economics in this framework does not provide concrete knowledge, but it provides a language. It provides concepts to obtain concrete knowledge in specific circumstances, or it can be applied to specific events. So it's very similar to a language. A language itself is a vehicle for deriving and obtaining concrete knowledge, but it is not concrete knowledge itself. And the same is true for the economic logic. Since the agents in this framework act purposefully, human acts with a certain intention in mind, certain purpose for their actions, understanding is an important element in applied economics. Understanding relates to the motives and the intentions behind the actions, behind the decisions that people made. So if we apply economics, we apply the framework, we apply the language of economics, we need historical data. And we need the historical method, including trying to understand why people did something, some acts did something. Mathematics in this framework can be a very powerful tool to describe abstract patterns. But it is not the only tool as a description, as for instance, the competitive order showed. We were able to discuss patterns in a competitive order without using mathematics. And we just formulated them in words. The tendency to cost minimization is a pattern. a very clear pattern, and it's clear what we mean, and we don't need the language of mathematics to describe it. But some other patterns, for instance a business cycle, can be far better described by using equations, by using a mathematical model. So in this framework, it's not that you either use mathematics or language. Both languages, the mathematical language and the verbal language, are fruitful and can be used. There's a very important other consequence for what economics can deliver in terms of knowledge and what it cannot deliver in terms of knowledge. From this framework, can be derived that there are no knowable quantitative economic or sociological laws. Because the future cannot be listed in the number of potential outcomes, there's a limit to computation and to quantification in economic theory. So econometrics, well known in mainstream economics, in this framework is a description of economic history at a certain location during a certain time period. No more, no less. Econometrics does not provide quantitative economic laws. It's an element of quantitative economic history, and a useful one, but it does not provide quantitative laws. Let me conclude by just mentioning one other method that is often used in the context of complexity economics and in trying to describe and derive emergent economic order. And that's the role of so-called agent-based modeling. How do we look at this method from the framework that I've just described in broad terms? It is a means for deriving, generating hypotheses about patterns and for falsifying, verifying hypotheses. It's not a direct road to economic laws, and it's not a description of economic laws either. So that concludes my lecture on the equilibrium concept, very central in mainstream economics, and order, which is an alternative concept for providing structure to what is happening in society, which is based on the assumption that the economy is a complex system and that the future is fundamentally uncertain.